So this morning we're going to take a look at the life of Elijah. Actually, both this week and next week in the morning worship service, we're going to be studying the life of Elijah, and specifically we're going to be right here in chapter 19, splitting it into two sections, the passage that Pastor Dave just read, and then we're going to take the latter half for next week. But as we begin this study on 1 Kings 19 for both this week and next, I'd like you to think about this. The fact that life is tough. And if you just think about your life, you think about all of the tough things and the tough situations that you encounter in your life, if it either be suffering and trials, if it be letdowns or brokenness, we go through difficulty and hardship, and I think many of us come from many different experiences, many different situations, so our suffering is unique in one sense, but at the same time, we all go through times that are tough. Certainly some are worse than others. And maybe right now here in your life is a particularly hard time. And when you think of how we often respond to these situations, I would often say that our response is one of fear and anxiety. If you think about all the tough things that you encounter, a lot of times, at least I know for me, my reaction is to be scared. My reaction is to worry about how things will turn out or how things will happen. You can think about these questions. Are you one who fears? Are you one who has or right now have anxieties? And I would bet that many of us have had fears and anxieties in our life, and many of us sitting right here today, though no one knows, have these fears and anxieties in our lives right now. So this morning we're going to come up to Elijah, a prophet of God, I would say one who was mature in his faith, a man of faith, and he has these fears and these anxieties. And I really think Elijah's a neat life to trace. I don't know if you've ever read through the story of Elijah, but the last couple times I've gotten the opportunity to preach, I don't blame you if you do not remember, because last year around this time was the first time I preached from a passage in Elijah, but it's been a really rewarding study for me. He's a really neat guy to study, but today we come to probably one of, I would say, at least in what's recorded, the lowest point in Elijah's life. The time he was down, the time he was the most low that is recorded for us. So as I said, this morning we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 8. Next week we're going to look at 1 Kings 19, 9 through 21. But both of these passages don't only just have in common that they're talking about Elijah, that Elijah's the main character, but they focus on the prophet of the Lord, the bold and the confident Elijah, in what I'd say, and go so far as to say, a state of depression. All right, this man of faith, depressed. So our theme for this morning is Elijah's depression teaches us about both the reality of and a response to depression. Again, the theme for this morning is Elijah's depression teaches us about both the reality of and a response to depression. So if you aren't there already, I would invite you to turn to 1 Kings chapter 19, 1 through 8, and just follow along as we're going to be going verse by verse through this story. This message is filled with application. I think it will touch upon each and every one of our lives, even if right now you aren't dealing with a certain area of anxiety. But as I said, a lot of application. I think a very rewarding text. But this morning we'll look at 1 Kings 19, 1 through 8. And we're going to split these 8 verses into 2 sections. Specifically, they translate into 2 points. We're going to look first, our first point is the reality of depression. And the second point, the second half of our passage, is a response to depression. So point number 1, we'll start out. I'll warn you, point number 1's a bit longer than point 2. Just give you that heads up. Point number 1 is from 1 Kings 19, 1 through 4, we learn of the reality of depression. So look with me at verse 1. We see Ahab reports to his wife Jezebel all that happened on Mount Carmel with Elijah. 1 Kings 19, 1 says, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So 2 questions may come to your mind if you're not familiar with this story. The first thing is, who is Ahab and Jezebel? Who is Ahab and Jezebel? And we're not going to, if you want to flip there just to scan it, you can look at 1 Kings 16, 29 through 33. But I'll just point out three things that we can see from 1 Kings 16, 29 through 33 as they introduce to us this husband and wife duo, Ahab and Jezebel. The first thing we learn from this is that Ahab is the king of Israel, and this is from verse 29 of chapter 16. So Ahab, if you know anything about the history of Israel, Israel split into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And Ahab, he was above this kingdom of Israel. So he is the highest of the high. He has the most authority. He is over this kingdom as the king. The second thing we learn about this husband and wife duo is King Ahab was the most wicked king up to that point. And this comes from 1 Kings 16:30. And again, if you know anything about the history of Israel, you know this was a wicked, a sinful, a terrible kingdom. So the fact that King Ahab is said to be the worst up to that point means that he was absolutely bad. King Ahab was the most wicked king up to that point. And then thirdly, the thing that we learned from 1 Kings 16, 29 through 33 for some context is that King Ahab's worship of idols seems to have come from, and I would say was influenced by his marriage to Jezebel. And this comes from verses 31 through 34, and we see Jezebel seems to be just as worse, if not worse, than her husband Ahab. We see that they were idol worshipers. So that just gives you a little bit of context. We're going to learn a whole lot more about these two, this king and this queen. But the second question that may come to mind is, what had Elijah just done? If you look again with me at 1 Kings 19:1, our text, it says, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. All that Elijah had done. And again, we don't have time to read through this chapter, but the second half of chapter 18 talks about all that Elijah had done. Specifically, his competition between him and the prophets of Baal. And just to summarize chapter 18 for you, Elijah sets up a competition or a test to see whose God is the real God. And Elijah proposes a test, and he even gives the prophets of Baal several advantages, the first one being that he allows them to go first. And he says, build an altar, and then call out to your God and have your God consume it with fire. And whoever's God does this, he is God. All right, so the prophets of Baal, they go about doing this. They set up their altar. They dance around the altar. They cry out to their God. They even cut themselves. But again and again is repeated in chapter 18, there's no answer at all. There's silence from Baal. But Elijah, he goes on to make his altar, and he tells the people to gather around, and he does probably the worst thing that you can do to make a fire, and he drenches it with water. He has them pour tons of water, and those who have made a fire before know that is one of the worst things to do in trying to make a good fire. But he drenches it with water, making it even more amazing that his God consumes that altar with fire. So Elijah in chapter 18 proves and he shows that his God is the one true and only God. So that's what Ahab's talking about when he tells his wife all that Elijah had done. And if you just look with me again at our verse, 1 Kings 19:1, I think it's really interesting that it says Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. Not all that God had done, but Elijah had done, showing and reiterating that Ahab refuses to credit God or to acknowledge God, just showing how far off Ahab was from God. And we're told at the tail end of verse 1 that Elijah killed all of the kings and the queens' prophets. And that's where we come to our next verse. If you look with me at 1 Kings 19:2, we see Jezebel declares a death threat against Elijah, as it says in verse 2. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." So it's interesting, Jezebel's talking here. It's not Ahab the king, but the queen, his wife, is absolutely furious. Most likely furious that Elijah would rebel against the king and the queen and serve another god. Absolutely furious, probably because he had spoken out against her religion, but also probably furious because he had just killed the leaders of her idolatrous religion in which she believed in. So she sets a death sentence against him for the very next day. And again, there's a lot of context that can go into this. We won't read the passages, but in 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah knows that Jezebel isn't messing around because she already had a history of killing the prophets of the Lord, as Obadiah had saved prophets that Jezebel was killing. So we know Elijah knows that Jezebel isn't messing around. She means business when she says that she's going to kill him. And Jezebel, just in general, our chapter shows it today, is just a very interesting character, as she seems to take more of a place of prominence in the scriptures, as she seems to even have some authority over her own husband. Oftentimes the queens of the kings are mentioned, but we actually see her taking a role in this story and taking action as well. So Jezebel takes a place of prominence, but a very wicked position in this story. So we see Jezebel's reaction to the news of Elijah's victory and defeat of the prophets of Baal. And now we get Elijah's response. So if you look with me at 1 Kings 19, 3 through 4, we'll make several points here. The first is that Elijah responds immediately with fear. So he gets the news of the death sentence, and we see his response is one of fear. 1 Kings 19:3 says this, "Then he was afraid." Then he was afraid. All right, and what I want us to do is I want us to think about how Elijah's feeling right here, how he's responding. And I want us to kind of look back and see how Elijah had responded to some similar things in the past. So if you look back with me at 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 through 2. So just go 2 chapters back. And I want us to see that this response of fear is completely abnormal for Elijah. Completely abnormal for Elijah. So we'll look at several passages. The first is 1 Kings 17, 1 through 2. It reads this way. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom before I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." And the word of the Lord came to him. So this first passage shows that Elijah is willing to make a declaration against the king. He is willing to make or to pronounce judgment against this king. And Elijah could have easily gotten the same type of death sentence from such a declaration. But we see Elijah does this boldly and he does this obediently to God. And a key phrase here is right in verse 2. If you look back there, it says, "The word of the Lord came to Elijah." All right, the word of the Lord came to him. And this is going to become a repeated phrase that we're going to see that Elijah responds to the word of the Lord. Next passage is just a few verses up. 1 Kings 17, 8 through 10 reads this way. And here's the phrase, "Then the word of the Lord came to him. Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you." So he arose and went to Zarephath. Again showing Elijah follows the word of the Lord. Go a chapter over. 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 1 through 2 reads this way. "After many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab." Again, our phrase right there in verse 1, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, and we see he follows, he obeys, and he follows what the Lord has commanded. And essentially, if you think about Ahab and who he is walking into a death trap. He's walking into his capture as Ahab had been searching for him. And then the last passage, again, you can just kind of scan over it. We won't read it in depth, but 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 7 through 15, we see Elijah goes to a man named Obadiah. And Elijah tells him to go to Ahab and tell him he has found Elijah. So he goes to this man Obadiah, who we see as a man of God, a man who has faith in God, and he tells him, "Hey, go tell Ahab that you found me." And we see Obadiah's response is with great fear. He believes Elijah will disappear and get off the scene, and Obadiah refuses to do it till finally Elijah tells him that he will definitely go to Ahab when he turns him in. And I'd like to make a point of application here. The application for our lives, thinking about Elijah, fearful in our text, 1 Kings 19, dealing with just days before Obadiah, who was fearful, I'd like to make this application. May we not think we are above the struggles of others, as we might face the very same thing ourselves. If we think about Elijah, he was bold, he was obedient, specifically in chapter 18, but in numerous ways in this text, and he stays that way with Obadiah, who was fearful. But then just a chapter over, in chapter 19, within a day's time, Elijah had the very same reaction that Obadiah did. So if we think about our lives, people may tell us their struggles, and you might become very judgmental towards them. You might get a feeling of superiority when someone starts maybe confessing their sin, or they really are open and honest with you. You might start to get a big head, thinking you're superior over them. You might even talk down to them as if they were lower than you. But I think we've got to realize that we are not above them, as we may eventually struggle with the very same things. As we see Elijah, he's confident, he's bold with Obadiah, but the very next day, he is just as fearful as Obadiah was. I even thinking about this application, that this is where the gospel comes in. This is where realizing that I am a sinner just like them, that I am no better than that person. Though I haven't sinned as they have, I very well might sin just like them. And I even think about our prayer life, and this, we can start praying 3 things in specific. First, that God would guard us from this judgmental and superior attitude towards others who confide in us or we hear of their sin. The second thing we can pray is that God would guard us from this sin that they're struggling with. And the third thing is praying a prayer of thanks. God, thank you for your grace in my life. God, thank you for guarding me from this sin. So we see that Obadiah struggled with fear, and though Elijah didn't at that moment, he eventually did the next day. Look back with me at our text at 1 Kings 19, 3-4. We saw that Elijah, his response to this death threat is one of fear, and now it goes even further. We see Elijah flees and hides for protection, as it says in verse 3. Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat under a broom tree. So we see this fear that Elijah's struggling with turns to action. And I'll ask you, has your fear ever turned into action, in which maybe you start taking matters into your own hands and doing things motivated by your fear? I want us to realize a contrast here. So again, we're going to look back at some context. If you flip with me 2 chapters back to 1 Kings 17, 1-4, I want to draw out a contrast between what we've just seen Elijah do to just a few chapters back, probably a few years before our account. So 1 Kings 17, 1-4 says this, and as I read this, start thinking about how Elijah's acting different than he does now in our passage. 1 Kings 17, 1-4. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word." And the word of the Lord came to him, "Depart from here and turn eastward, and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." Think about this situation that I've just read. As I kind of alluded to earlier, I would say Elijah had his head on the chopping block, just like he does in our passage in chapter 19. Just as Jezebel gave the death sentence, the passage I just read, Ahab, we're not given his words, but we're told later on that he hunts down Elijah. So we know he's trying to get Elijah. He's at least trying to capture him, if not kill him. And I want us to think about this passage and what Elijah does and what we see a few chapters back that Elijah does. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah takes matters into his own hands, and he flees in his own decision, in his own direction. But notice chapter 17, it's not Elijah's decision, but it's the Lord's decision, who says, "Elijah, go there, and I will protect you, and I will provide for you." So we see in Elijah's fear in chapter 19, he looks to himself rather than the Lord for guidance, direction, and protection. And again, as I emphasized in some of those passages earlier, we saw Elijah continually followed the word of the Lord. And that's repeated again and again and again in this story, the word of the Lord. And we see Elijah responds to it. If you look at chapter 19, in our text, the word of the Lord is not mentioned. We see that Elijah did not wait patiently to hear the Lord's direction as he was fearful and anxious. So several points of application. The first is this: we often completely forget about God in times when we fear or are anxious. We completely forget about God in times when we fear or are anxious. And I'd say oftentimes, if we think about our initial reaction, oftentimes we look to ourselves or we look to someone else and not God when we face difficulty and hardship. It's very easy to completely forget about God. And we see Elijah, in Elijah's fear, he forgets to think theologically. He had been responding to the word of the Lord all throughout his ministry, but here he relies upon himself, not looking for the word of the Lord at all. The second point of application is related, and we see that Elijah shows how easy it is to forget all about what God has done in the past in times when we fear or are anxious. He forgets all about not only God, but all God had done in the past. And if you think about your life, I would imagine you could relate. All right, we see Elijah. If you think about his earlier life, and we've read a few passages, we see how God provided for him when this drought came. We see how God provided for him against the prophets of Baal and gave him safety. And it seems like all that goes out the window when Elijah comes up against Jezebel. I even think of a story later in the Bible with Jesus, related. Jesus feeds the 5,000, and the disciples are questioning, how are you going to feed them? And we see he miraculously was able to provide food. And just a few chapters over, or days later, we get the same account, just with 4,000 people, and the disciples are asking the very same thing. How are you going to feed them? They forget how Jesus had provided for thousands in the past, and they don't allow that to affect the present. And as I said, we all too often forget how God has provided and protected and guided and worked things out in our past. And as I was just thinking this week, I think there's two ways we can fight against just this forgetfulness that we often have. The first is simply to pray, Lord, help me to remember what you've done for me in the past. Help me to remember what is recorded in the Bible. But the second thing is to take the step of actually meditating and reflecting upon these things in our normal daily life. As we're driving in the car, going for a run, doing the dishes, even lying in bed, thinking about how has God worked in my life? And I think if we do that, that's going to help us in these times of fear, in these times of anxiety, to think about and be reassured of what God has done in the past. And the third point of application I'll make is that Elijah shows how your response can change in situations that you face that are the same. All right, so just as back with Ahab, when he declared the drought, we see he was bold, he was obedient, but now with Jezebel, he's fearful and anxious. And I'd say it's very similar situations. So I'd say for us, don't think that you are invincible to temptation and sins that you have defeated in the past. As we see, Elijah falls into something that didn't seem to struggle with at all in the past. So as we go back to our text, Elijah is fearful. We see that fear takes action. And now we come to a third thing about his fear. We see Elijah goes so far as to ask the Lord to kill him. If you look back with me at verse 4. 1 Kings 19:4 reads this way. And he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life. For I am no better than my fathers. So we see Elijah has become so fearful that he has no desire to continue living. He sees this as his only option, to die. And I'll ask this question. Have you ever gotten so low, been so anxious, that you have just wanted to die? Even thought about committing suicide? Few points of application. The first is this, and we kind of get this from this whole picture of Elijah and his fear and his anxiety and even depression, is that we learn something about the reality of anxiety and depression, that these are very real things. They aren't something that we should minimize. The second is related, and Elijah shows that fear and anxiety and depression are very real struggles for the Christian. And I'd go even so far as to say, and we can see from Elijah, even the mature Christian. Elijah is a prophet of God, a man of great faith, yet we see him scared for his life, anxious so much that he does not want to live any longer. And there would be those, I believe, that would say anxiety, fear, doesn't belong in a born-again Christian's life. There would be those that would say that someone who's struggling with these things doesn't have faith at all, or they're certainly not mature in their faith. But I think Elijah shows that even those that are growing in the Lord and are mature in their faith can struggle with these things. Teachers and pastors and elders could struggle with fear and anxiety. And I think this week as I was studying, I thought of the example of Charles Spurgeon. And I would imagine some of you know of Charles Spurgeon, but he was a preacher in the 1800s, nicknamed the Prince of Preachers. So he was very well known. He's written, many of his sermons are in print even today. In Charles Spurgeon, he dealt with depression almost his whole ministry. And Spurgeon is even quoted in saying, "My spirits were sunken so low that I could weep by the hour like a child, and yet I knew not what I wept for." So this excellent and famous preacher, Charles Spurgeon, was a depressed man. He was a true child of God, but yet he dealt with this fear and this anxiety within his life. The third application from these points is that Elijah shows how you can go from a spiritual high to rock bottom in a matter of minutes. Just think with me as I read through this list about all that Elijah had done up to this point. Elijah boldly declared a drought to the king for the Lord. He was fed by ravens. At his presence, food was provided both for him and a widow and her son who were about to starve to death. Elijah raised the widow's son from the dead. Elijah boldly walks into Ahab's hands. Elijah competes with the prophets of Baal to show God as the one true and only God. Elijah kills the prophets of Baal. Elijah runs with super speed to beat Ahab to Jezreel. And as I read through that list, these are all victories. These are all successes in ministry. And I would say that Elijah was going through a very good time in ministry. He was serving the Lord. He was obedient. But now we see after all of this, in a matter of minutes, in a day's time, Elijah is now fearful and in a state of depression. Elijah shows that it is very possible to be doing good, even be serving the Lord well and successfully, and then to become anxious in moments due to something that goes on. And I think, again, this teaches us that we need to be on our guard, to not let an especially good time of ministry or time where you have been excited and zealous for the Lord to cause you to think you have reached perfection. So as we consider this first point of 2 from 1 Kings 19, 1 through 8, we learn of the reality of depression. We see this as a very real struggle for the Christian in their life. In talking about the reality, I realize that with fears and anxieties, there's certainly different degrees. Some people struggle in the sense that they're fearful for just a day. Some it lasts for months, and some even years that depression can last. Some people are fearful or worrying about things that other people, it doesn't bother them at all. So this depression, this fear, can be unique to each and every person, and it can vary at different degrees. But I think the point that we need to consider is that this is a very real thing. We shouldn't minimize it. This is a real struggle even for the Christian. But the next point I'd like to consider, and as I said, this one will be a bit shorter, is a response to depression. All right, from the second half of our passage, we see a response to depression. And this is where we get point number 2 from 1 Kings 19, 5 through 8. We get a response to depression. The first thing we see in verse 5 is the Lord provides food and water for Elijah. If you look with me at 1 Kings 19, 5 through 6, it reads this way. And he lay down and slept under a broom tree, and behold, an angel touched him and said to him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. In this section, I want us to focus on the Lord's provision in Elijah's life. We see from this text that the Lord provides for Elijah when he is depressed. When he's scared, he has no desire to live at all. The Lord provides him a meal. He provides him a time of rest, and he provides him water. And this should remind us of the passage we already looked at, in that God fed Elijah with ravens, giving him drink from the brook of Cherith. So we see that the Lord, he's even a God of provision, even in our low times. Not just when things are going good, but the Lord provides even in times where we're struggling. So the application I'll make here is this. I'd say, though subtle, in one sense it could be easily missed, we see that these 4 verses of point number 2 exemplify how great and gracious of a God we have. All right, I just want you to consider what we've seen Elijah do so far in this text, and consider Elijah who ignores God, who doesn't pray to him, who relies upon himself instead of God, who is weak and helpless and hopeless. He's physically, he's mentally, he's emotionally, and even spiritually broken down. Consider God's actions toward Elijah. God's actions are completely contrary to what Elijah deserves. God does not reprimand, he does not punish, he does not tell Elijah to get up and get back and serve, but God's actions, I would say, are gently and lovingly providing. We see that God's actions show that he's an understanding God and a forgiving God. Understanding in the sense that he gets that Elijah is weak and tired. Forgiving in that he does not punish Elijah for his lack of faith. But he also shows he's a God who provides. He's a providing God, in that he provides Elijah rest and food and drink. God gave Elijah what he needed in that time. And the second point of application that I'll make from verses 5 through 6 is this, that if God responds to weak and sinful Elijah this way, if this is his response to depressed Elijah, shouldn't this be ours? Shouldn't our response to those who struggle with fear and anxiety and depression be that we're understanding and forgiving and providing for them? How often is this the complete opposite of how we treat them? We could say this for any struggle or sin, but I want to focus right now on how you respond to someone that comes up to you and maybe expresses a fear. Maybe your spouse comes to you and says how they're anxious about something, or someone is willing enough to be open and honest about their depression. Do you respond as God responds to Elijah? I'd say oftentimes we might respond by trying to give them advice. Maybe we just say, it's okay. Maybe we say, don't be anxious. And I'd say those responses are far from how God responds to Elijah here, by giving him rest, by giving him food and giving him water. And a verse that comes to mind is Ephesians 5:1-2 that reads this way, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love, as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." So thinking about how God has loved us and provided for us, and we should show that same type of love to others. The second thing we see from this second section is from 1 Kings 19, 7-8. If you look with me there, we see the Lord provides food and water for Elijah a second time. 1 Kings 19, 7-8 read this way, "And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, 'Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you.' And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God." So we see that God provides for Elijah in a miraculous way, and we may even question how Elijah responds to that, but we see he falls back asleep, and God wakes him up, and he provides for him even more. And I'd say this is teaching Elijah a very valuable lesson, that he needs the Lord. He needs the strength that the Lord will provide. He's scared because he's relying on himself. God shows him, it is I who gives you the strength. It is I who provide for you. It is I who sustain you, not yourself. So we talk about what should our response be to depression. I would say that we think about all that the Lord does for Elijah here. May our response to God's actions here be to run and to flee to him in our time of need, in our depression, in our fears and worries. May we run to God knowing that he is understanding and he's a forgiving and he's a providing God. This knowledge of God should cause us to not rely on ourselves, to not look to ourselves in times of trouble, but to go immediately to God in prayer. And I think it's something that, if you think about it, you've been taught from a very young child. If you've grown up in the church, I think there's songs about trusting and obeying, and it sounds like such a simple thing, but I'd say day in and day out, every single hour, we need to remind ourselves that I need to trust in the Lord, that I need to depend upon Him. And it sounds like such a simple thing, but something that so often we really struggle to do, to trust in the Lord. I just think about the Psalms. I don't have any in specific, but you think about the Psalms. Oftentimes the psalmists cry out and say, the Lord is my refuge and my strength. The Lord is my rock. He's my salvation. And I think the Psalms are excellent examples of those who are turning to the Lord when they have these fears, when they have these worries. So as we close, we think about these 2 points. The first being Elijah teaches us the reality of depression, the fact that we will deal with fear, anxiety, and depression, even as Christians, and we should not minimize these. So if we haven't gone through any specific time in our life where we've been depressed or been anxious, maybe you won't, but I'd say for many of us, though no one knows around us, we may go through these times. But the second thing we see from Elijah is a response. And though Elijah doesn't necessarily have this response, I think we can learn a response about how we see God's attributes and God's character shining forth through this passage. We serve a God who's understanding, a God who's forgiving and providing. And I think this passage teaches us that we need to run to Him. We need to flee to Him. We need to look to Him in these times where we're fearful, where we're anxious, and where we're depressed. And I don't think we're to learn that these fears will go away overnight. They may still continue to haunt us and tempt us and be struggles for us, but we can continue to grow in our trust of God. So as we saw today, I'd say this passage is rich with application. I know for at least myself, it was very helpful and very rewarding. And as I said, next week we're going to look at the second half of this text that deals with similar things, and I think we get even more of a response and more of a help in these times of struggle. Let's close in a word of prayer. God, I just thank you for the life of Elijah. And as I said today, he's a really neat life to study, a really neat life to trace and to go through. And Lord, you show us many aspects of his life, and in one sense, many aspects of the Christian life, of times that we can be serving you zealously, excitedly. But at the same time, Elijah is a very real man, and he shows us the struggles, and he shows us the suffering that we can go through. And Lord, my heart goes out for any today that are struggling with any type of fear or anxiousness. Lord, I pray that you would just comfort that person. Pray that you would bring them peace in their life. And Lord, I pray that you would just grow them in their trust and dependence upon you, Lord. I just pray for the future, Lord, for fears that come our way. Lord, we pray that we would be people that wouldn't look to ourselves, but that we would continue to grow in our faith in you. Lord, I pray that you would just continue to provide for us, and we have faith that you will, Lord. And we thank you for being a God who is understanding, a God who's forgiving, and a God who's providing. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to remember all the times that you have been there for us, and even all the times we've seen in the scriptures. Lord, I pray that those things would be taken into the present and would really help us to have our trust and our faith in you. Lord, be with the rest of our service and be with the rest of our day. And in your name I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Cruise, for that word. There's something in it for all of us, I believe, both in how to handle times of depression and also how to respond to those who experience the same. So I trust we'll take that with us and apply it as well. In